from Vienna. My name is Ernst Fehr, and I am a professor at the University of Vienna. And I have the pleasure to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the Vienna Behavioral Economics Network, or VBEN for short. The purpose of the VBEN is to bring together top academics with business people and policymakers, but essentially anyone with an interest to discuss insights from behavioral and experimental economics. Our focus is not merely academic, but it is on how behavioral and experimental economics can contribute to improve decision-making in business, society, and the state. We normally meet in attractive locations here in Vienna to reach out to non-academics, to mingle and have a drink after the talks and the discussions. Unfortunately, the coronavirus and the social distancing that comes with it killed that concept, or at least the drinks and the mingling part. In thinking about what to do, we decided to go virtual, which also provided us with the opportunity to reach out to people outside of Vienna. For the first global VBEN event, we have found two scholars which are just perfect for our purposes. They are not only star academics, but they also have a great talent for clear and accessible communication. Dan Ariely is a truly original thinker. He has contributed to behavioral economics with many ingenious and unconventional experiments. Dan is known to wide public through his TED Talks and his best-selling books like Predictably Irrational and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. His books are page-turners and provide a much-prized combination of being funny and thought-provoking at the same time. Dan is also ideal for the VBEN because he's active in consulting and has founded a research center to develop, I quote, behavioral interventions that help people be happier, healthier, and wealthier. Dan Ariely has been at Duke University since 2008 and has taught at MIT's Sloan School of Management before that. Ernst Fehr is a towering figure in the field. He has made path-breaking contributions to bring notions of fairness and cooperation back into economics. And he is a pioneer in the biological foundations of economics, especially on neuroeconomics. Ernst has not only had a tremendous impact on academia, but he has also repeatedly been named to be the most influential economist in the German-speaking area. He has been faithful to the University of my hometown, the wonderful city of Zurich, for more than 25 years, despite numerous attempts to lure him to top universities in the UK and the US. All that remains is to express my gratitude. Many thanks to Dan and Ernst for being with us today. Thanks to the people from Fair Advice who have organized everything to make this event technically possible. And finally, many thanks to Christina Meyer, who will host today's discussion about the best way out of the Corona-Krise. Many thanks to all of you. And with these words, I hand over to Christina Meyer, calling Zurich.
Yes, thank you very much to Vienna. Thank you very much indeed, Jean-Robert, for your very nice words of welcome and for introducing our globally renowned guests, Dan Ariely and Ernst Fehr. A very warm welcome also from my side, also to all our participants from all over the globe. I see Russia, I see Argentina, Bilbao, North Carolina, Chile, Philippines, and so on. We are really, really impressed. Thanks for joining us. And for sure, you can ask questions. You can write in a chat, and these questions will be sent to me. We are looking forward to receive your questions. Dan, I start with you. Where exactly are you in Israel?
I am in a town called Caesarea. I was happily sitting in my office in Durham, North Carolina, and I got a call from the Israeli government, and they asked me to show up here. So I did. This was about 2.5 months ago. Since then, I've been sitting on this chair with this picture behind me, hardly moving. And I had the privilege to try and help, but also real kind of painful exposure to what's happening, and maybe kind of just a couple of words about my journey through this time. So when I came to Israel, the task was relatively simple. The task was, how do we give instructions in a way that people are likely to follow? By the way, these are not Germans, right? These are Israelis, so it's a little tougher to get that going. But you know, when you say to people things like "don't leave home," if somebody has to go out, do they feel like, okay, if I went out, I might as well go and visit 10 friends, or do they go straight back? How do you make it so that people feel comfortable to tell each other, hey, maybe don't stand so close to me, right? How do you change those rules? How do you make it desirable? Anyway, we worked on that problem for a while. Then it became very clear that schools were not set to teach from a distance, right? A 7th grade teacher with 30 kids on Zoom, not much education is going on there. Then we found out that domestic violence was increasing against women, a lot against kids. Right? Basically, the recipe for human violence is to put people in close proximity together with stress. That's the recipe.
So how did you find out this?
So originally this were self-reports, and then we did some studies, and then we created 2 intervention programs. We created 1 intervention programs for adults, because, you know, we all have anger. The question is, do we let this go out of us? And how do you get people to be able to control their anger better, and then when you need to get it out, you do something else. So we created a program for adults, we created a program for kids. Then there was the real question of the stimulus package. How do you give money back to the economy in a way that is likely to be effective? There were questions about releasing prisoners because of fear of and now there's lots of questions about how you open the economy.
Exactly. Actually, to be honest, then I was really worrying.
Always be honest. I do lots of research on dishonesty. And
I know. Oh, wow. You got me trapped. No, maybe you can just give us a little insight about the picture, because it's really...
This author is called Litvinovsky, and it's a picture from Shabbat, the Saturday for the Jewish people. It was hanging out in my grandparents' house. Then my mother took it. I've never stared at this picture for so long. I've basically been in this spot looking at this picture behind me from 7 a.m. to midnight for the last 2.5 months. I don't think I can leave it.
No, but you can paint it. You can paint it yourself by heart, I guess.
That's right.
Ernst, coming to you. You are in Zurich, as far as I know, in home office. And
in the real office.
You are in a real office. See, Dan? We know what you are thinking a lot about. It's this testing. What I was wondering before we talk about this, from your scientific point of view, what fascinates you most about the current human behavior?
Well, what fascinates me most is the aspects that are related to a lot of work that I did in the past on voluntary cooperation and the conditions under which people are willing to cooperate. You know, what we face here is a global crisis that requires the cooperation of the whole population, basically. And I mean, the matter of the fact is that without the voluntary cooperation of the population, nothing would go, nothing would be possible here. I mean, even if you impose a lockdown, if people don't obey that, the government can do nothing about it. And so you need this obedience by the people, and you need it that most of it comes voluntarily, because we can't, even if you would quadruple the police force, you wouldn't be able to enforce that just with sanctioning. And so what we observe here is a tremendous amount of voluntary cooperation by the people, at least at the beginning of the crisis. So the people followed the orders of the government, mostly, I believe, because of rational insight that this is something that is necessary to do. But it's also interesting to see that over time, these cooperation levels tend to unravel. So if you look at the mobility data in the different countries, then what you see is a sharp decline in mobility and then a gradual increase in mobility. So more and more people started to disobey, so to speak, what should be done. And it gradually went back. And that's a typical pattern, interestingly, that we also see in many laboratory experiments. So there is a high degree of willingness to cooperate, but it's not always the case that this can be sustained in the long run. So you need additional measures. To some extent, that's related to sanctioning. But it relates to an old theme of that has been in my mind for a long time, and that it has to do with what are the cornerstones of modern civilization. And I think economists have gotten it only half right and half wrong, because we always assume that when we have a global public good like here, preventing the pandemic, it's really a global public good, that this can be solely resolved by government intervention, and it can't. You need the people, you need the people, and you need their compliance, and without the compliance you can do nothing, basically. And that relates to much bigger topics in that relate to questions such as why are there states, why are there companies, why are there organizations. All these basic tendencies in behavior relate to these very big questions. So that fascinates me in this crisis.
I have the impression that at the beginning there was really a huge fear about this unknown virus. And we saw all the pictures from China or from the northern of Italy, with people dying in hospitals, dying in front of hospitals, really a huge mess. Now these pictures are gone. And the fear somehow, I think, went away as well. So the fear, I think, was really like supporting a lot the cooperation and solidarity amongst the people.
This is partly true, and but even now, what's the infection rate? What's the percentage of infected people in Switzerland? The percentage of infected people in Switzerland is still very, very low, and the probability, at least in the current situation, of getting infected is, if I go in the streets, is very low. I mean, the cost is high if I get infected, typically, but the probability is very low. So therefore, it must be more than just fear. It must also be insight into the necessity. And even now, so I mean, I gave an interview last weekend to a bigger newspaper in Switzerland, and what I was saying is, I'm surprised that not more people wear masks in public transport during rush hour, for example. During rush hour, nobody in Zurich, I mean, 95% of the people don't wear masks. They are not physically distant. They're much closer than a meter often. And so there are many people who are kind of afraid of that situation. But we have a cultural situation here that the government doesn't take a lead here in contrast to, for example, Germany or Austria, where they clearly say masks are useful, masks are something that helps, masks prevent infections. The Swiss government responds very differently. I think it's wrong how they respond. They don't play a good role model. And the consequence is that you have basically people wearing no masks. And that means over time that a resurrection of the pandemic or the virus is much more likely here than it is in other countries.
Yeah, I understand, and it's also a question of trust, right? So it's a loss of trust. Dan, sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm interrupting you.
Go ahead.
So, I think you're absolutely right. There was extra fear in the beginning, and I can tell you that I was a part of a couple discussions where there was a real questions from governments about how much fear to create. And one of the things that was clear is if you get lots of fear, you'll get a lot of compliance early on, but maybe there'll be fading of trust later on, and things would get out of hand. But I think there was such a fear of governments, of lack of adherence, that they basically pushed extra hard on fear. For example, think about the information display we get. We all get displays of how many people get infected in Corona and how many people die. We don't really have many interfaces that show us how many people die in percentage to how many people die in a regular week, on how much it is compared to other things. I'm not saying it's the same as the flu, but nobody's putting it in perspective. What we've done is we put in the news, here's the number of people who are sick. Here's the number of people who are dying. Let's just focus on that. That's, of course, a very frightening thing. And I want to say one other thing about fear. In psychology, there's something called the identifiable victim effect, which is the idea that if you see one person suffering, your heart goes to them. And the cost doesn't matter so much. You'll save them, right? You're not thinking about, could I save other people? Would it be cheaper to save other people? Could I save 3 people tomorrow instead of this person? No. You see somebody in stress, you see somebody who's suffering, your heart goes to them, and that leads our action. The Corona crisis, we all had an image of somebody who needs a ventilator and doesn't have one. We all had the image of somebody who needs a hospital bed. And these are terrible images. But they're also images that chill our heart. And because of that, our actions were different as well. Imagine that the coronavirus worked differently. That the moment it hit somebody, that person would die on the spot. The same probability of people dying as now, but there wouldn't be this period of hospital. There wouldn't be this period of needing ventilators. It would have still been very frightening disease, but I think we would have reacted very, very differently for that. And one other thing, and I think this is kind of moving a little bit to the next topic. This is also a situation where we have been working with very little data. Like, we've been with this virus for a while, and we had very little understanding of what's going on. In early March, and now I'm going to say something, please don't hate me for this, but one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to get a group of young people who would be willing to volunteer to get infected.
Oh, really?
Because, but imagine the universe of people in the world. Then we have the people who get infected, then we get the people who get seriously infected, and then we get the people who die. But we don't know who are the people who don't get infected. And we don't know who are the people who get infected very lightly. And, you know, we're making a lot of assumptions about this, and we're closing economies, and we're doing all kinds of things with very little data. By the way, I did collect a group of people who were willing to do that, but the government would not allow us to do it. It's kind of interesting that even though it was going to be a volunteer effort, they thought of this as immoral, whereas making decisions without information doesn't seem immoral, right? When you make decisions without information, you can hurt lots and lots of people, but that somehow seems okay. But for me, it is shocking how the whole world, we have not taken actions to, and I know it's terrible, right? But it's also terrible not to understand. The longer we don't understand this virus, the longer we're creating potentially a lot of damage. And how can it be? And, you know, I'm sure many people here on the call are experimentalists, right? We love data. We love to collect data. We want to collect data early. We want decisions based on data. But nevertheless, we had really not enough effort on anything that has to do with data collection about what's really going on.
I think I can support that statement. I mean, to be not overly critical, I think at the beginning of March or towards mid-March, the government had to act, and they had to act in the absence of a lot of information, and it was impossible in the short period of time in which they had to act to collect that information. And they had to act under a lot of uncertainty about the situation and about the effects they will create with their actions. So now you could argue that it's their own fault because they didn't prepare as much as they should have. I mean, countries like South Korea and Taiwan and other Asian countries, they prepared much more. They were more affected in the past. We just couldn't, we in the West or in Western Europe and in the US also and in other countries, we just couldn't imagine that it hits us so hard. And so it was kind of a collective failure to some extent. There were a few people who did warn, but they were kind of callers in the desert that nobody heard at the time. Now, so basically, I also didn't say we should create a lockdown. And at that point, there was little choice but to work with a very kind of blunt measure, a total lockdown. But the real fault of the governments is that at that point in time, when they saw it so serious, they didn't start to collect data. And that's something they must be held responsible. I mean, basically, and even now, when we go back to normal step by step, one problem will be that we will have to live with the virus for quite some time, because I am not so optimistic that we will have a vaccine in the short term. So usually the vaccine development takes more like 10 years than 2 years. Now it might be quicker in this case because governments invest a lot of money and encourage the companies. But nevertheless, it could take 4 or 5 years. It could easily mean that we have to live 4 or 5 years with the virus. Now, in that situation, what we need is a collective surveillance and monitoring system that gives us the information about the geographical and the demographic distribution of the infections. And that allows us to localize the hotspots early on. And that allows us to gain important time between infection and when it would otherwise have become obvious. You know, from the infection to a case, it lasts sometimes 7-8 days because people show up in the hospital a week later or 10 days later when they have infected another 25 or 30 people or more. So we need this collective system of testing, and unless we implement that, we will not be able to properly respond. And I had just this morning a discussion with somebody who works in developing countries. And the interesting thing is that in some developing countries, they do have something like that because they have been hit in the past much more often by these crises, and the health system is much less well developed than it is here. So that was their only chance to contain the virus and the epidemic in their countries. So the upshot of all this is, unless we develop a collective surveillance and monitoring system with regular testing of a large amount of people, of a large number of people, such that we can really have representative insights, representative samples for each country, we will not be able to go back to normal in the way we would like to.
Yes,
I want
Sure.
to add a couple of things to this. So Ernst started by mentioning how much this is a collective action problem. And I want to emphasize this. Imagine that you live in a country and 10% of the people don't pay taxes. 10% of the people don't pay taxes. Imagine you live in a country where everybody is on lockdown and 10% of the people don't pay attention. That's much more than 10% of the problem, because these people can destroy everything for everybody. So that's one point. The second point is that in the beginning in Israel, we did the tracing of the people who got sick. And you looked at those traces and you said, who are those people? Like, I wake up in the morning, I get coffee, I go to work, I come back home, maybe I stop in the grocery store. Those people that were early test cases, they went to 80 different places a day. Like, who are they? Now, when I looked at them in the beginning, it was shocking. But then it became very clear. These are super spreaders, right? These are people that start by being everywhere. They did not get infected by chance. They got infected because they are very, very busy people. They do lots and lots of things. And then, of course, they're also more likely to infect other people. Now, those super spreaders are one of the big challenges in society. I live alone. I have a car. I go to my office. Not a big deal. If you're a super spreader, that's a really big deal. Now, what do you think? Are super spreaders more likely to be wealthy or poor? Of course, poor.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
The odds that somebody has their own office and their own car and their own room, and all of these are different. And there's another thing. Imagine you're a low-income individual, and let's say you work in deliveries. And one day you wake up and you cough and you have fever. And you're supposed to self-quarantine yourself. But you need money. What are you going to do? It's a public good problem, but you can't do it. So for me, this crisis, without creating a security blanket for the people who, we all want them to quarantine themselves, but if you don't help them, it's crazy to assume that they could, especially in a country like the US, when unless if you don't have any unemployment or you don't have any ability, you're just going to be hungry. So
you just cannot afford to stay at home. That's
exactly.
the problem. But Ernst, to come back to you, you require, we could see that in the media, you require a program based on two pillars: wide-ranging randomized testing for COVID-19 and systematic learning. Which measures are effective, which are not? So this is also about data, right? And could you go into some details about what an effective testing would look like concretely? What steps would be necessary, and how to finance this, and how to make clear to the public, to the media, to the governments, to everybody that it's necessary?
Well, I think what is very important in this context, when the infection rate is going down, that we have to make clear it's going down because we had very drastic measures. I mean, when you look at Brazil or other countries, or if you would have objective data for Russia, for example, or for Iran, where they didn't do it as harshly, or they reopened, you see basically these exponential curves, or at least linear or exponential, basically. So if we wouldn't have had drastic measures, we would be there. I mean, we would be like Northern Italy. You know, Northern Italy would be everywhere. So this is why I support the lockdown measures for an initial phase. Now, when it comes to the testing, I think the resources that got lost through the lockdown, they are orders of magnitude higher than the resources that are needed for testing. I mean, at least for European countries, it wouldn't be that costly to do, for example, for Switzerland, to test 10,000 people every 7 to 10 days. Okay, so you would have a representative sample. You would exactly know where are the hotspots. You would exactly know how is the age distribution of the infections. How is the distribution across professions, across industries, across regions, and that knowledge is extremely important because it allows you to intervene specifically where you have the problem, and not to have a blunt lockdown for the whole country. So you really need localized measures. And when it comes to that are kind of low cost interventions, you may have a lockdown that only applies for 5 villages in some region of a canton, okay, and not more. And the reason why you see now this take action for the next step. So I hope that everybody who is listening here signs this initiative that we started in order to create public pressure for the governments. It is amazing how little role it has played in the public discussions, this necessity for broad testing. And I'm just, the only hope that I have is we repeat each other. We appeal to the politicians. And I had just this morning this discussion with people from the Corona workforce in Switzerland, and it seems that the people in that workforce think the same way, so that we need a collective surveillance and monitoring system. And basically it's part of the resilience of a community. It's part of the resilience of a country to the pandemic, basically. It must be a standard part of it. And we must develop plans for the future when we initiate which steps and when we initiate these testing procedures that we now need. Because we don't need, I mean, once we have a vaccine, we may kind of be able to reduce that. You know, we also don't have a randomized testing for the usual flu, the annual flu, because we can contain the cost of the flu otherwise. So, but we need it here. And this is the reason why we have this public initiative where I really hope that all the people, sign it, go to the internet, look at it and sign it up. So yesterday, Oliver Hart, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, signed. So we get more and more prominent people who join us. Dan,
what's your comment about it? Are you going to sign?
First of all, I do everything that Ernst asks me. So that's
that's nice.
That's a good rule for on life, and so far it has worked well for me. But I want to say a couple of things on this thing. So first of all, I think it's absolutely crazy that we do general lockdowns. You know, London, New York have subway systems. That's just if you're a virus, that makes you very happy. If you're human, less so. I'm now in a place that, you know, I haven't seen anybody in 2 months. A lockdown doesn't matter. here. Also, if there are neighborhoods or small towns when there's no virus, keep some social distancing and open the economy. What's the point? I teach at Duke, and my proposal to my university for the fall semester was to lock me up with 400 undergrads in a dorm. Right? If we'll all wait for a few days, make sure we're fine, we'll all go to one dorm, limit the connection from the outside world, we could be fine. I said, I'll teach every morning, I'll teach at night, in the middle of the day they could do whatever they do. There's no reason to say that the only solution for that is nobody moves and nobody sees anybody. That just doesn't make sense. And we do it for simplicity, right? So it's very simple to say lockdown. Much harder to try and figure out how to do it. But the cost.
It was a mixture also of distrust. Yeah. I think when I think back to the discussion in Switzerland that we had, that the center was very distrusting of the regions that they can do it themselves. You had the same discussion in Germany. They wanted to impose a general, I mean, what you can impose is general rules, but that can be flexibly, so to speak, applied in the different regions. For example, in Germany, they have now a rule that if the percentage of infections surpasses a certain share of the population, then they have to take the following actions. But they can at least condition it on the share of infected people. That has not been done in the past. Regardless of the share, regardless of whether you had 0.5% infections or 3% infections or 5% infections, they imposed the same rules. And that's the thing that I referred to at the beginning. And the reason why we need widespread testing is exactly then we can avoid that. We can avoid these blunt measures and we can intervene localized, in a localized way, in an appropriate localized way.
Yeah, so that I think is one thing. We need willingness to apply different rules in different places. And we need different permission from the government, and we need acceptance from the citizens. And then I think the testing does three things. First of all, the testing tells us what's going on and where can we open and when we need to close. And without that, we'll probably be too risk averse and pay with the economy in too high of a price. Then the second thing is that still we don't know much about this virus. And if we don't do extensive testing, we will not know. For example, all the people who didn't get infected yet, we don't know if they can get infected or not. If you look historically at epidemiological predictions, they always are dramatically overshooting compared to reality. Now, because they assume that all people are the same. So we take the few people, whatever number of people are infected in the beginning, and we say these are just a random sample of people. Let's assume that the virus will continue in the same way. Most likely not. Most likely the first set of people who got infected were not just a random selection. We have this very simplistic notion of the human body. We're all the same for a virus. Maybe not. And we don't understand it. And then the last thing that I think testing is needed is to figure out who are the people who are safe. So, if you have antibodies, right, we have two types of tests. We have a test, are you sick? And we have a test to figure out if you have antibodies. These are different tests.
That's true, but we don't know if you are immune, if you have the antibodies.
What we know is that you're immune for now. We don't know if you're immune for a long time.
Yes.
But if you have antibodies, go forward and help other people. So another thing that I wanted to do in the beginning is I wanted to get everybody who got antibodies, I want them to go and sit next to, replace all the people who worked in old people's homes, right? Old people's homes are very risky places. And what you want is that all the people who would work there would be people with antibodies. So they're not risking the people who reside. Now, like if we don't know who those people are, how can we get them out and helping the economy and create more trust? And by the way, if they start walking around, those are the people you want walking around, right? Because they actually help move the economy.
Yeah, it's actually just a piece of information here. So we have a researcher here at the University of Zurich, Ardiano Aguzzi, and he just showed me data yesterday. He has done an enormous amount of testing, and his the antibody test that he developed gives you almost, I mean, it depends from the day of the first symptom. When you do a test at the day of the first symptom, you are not as precise in your test as when you do a test 10 days after the first symptom. So every day after the symptom, the test becomes more precise. But what he shows in his data is that roughly at 12 or 13 days after the symptoms arrived, he has a test that gives you almost with 100% certainty an answer whether the person has been infected or not. It has antibodies, very reliable. So these testing procedures become very reliable in a short period of time, and we can apply that. But I think in the current situation, what is even more important is tests for infection. Because the share of people who has already got the virus is probably almost, in most countries, it's less than 5% of the population. So there are still these other 95% who can get infected potentially. And we have to avoid that we run into a second wave, a second exponential curve. And a precondition to avoid that is this widespread randomized testing. But I have seen there are lots of interesting questions coming up in the chat, so maybe we take up a few of them. For example, somebody asked, what if, I mean, when we do this, when we have this surveillance system, how can we prevent that the governments use it for other purposes? Now, I mean, this boils down to the question of trust in the government. And whether you live in a country that has a democratic tradition or not. As it turns out, it is extremely important that the population has trust in the government, because the more there is distrust, the more they don't believe in the messages that they get from the government. For example, one of the very bad consequences of the Swiss government's reluctance to say that masks help is that people are very reluctant to wear masks. But we know that there's a lot of evidence that they help. They prevent that you infect other people. So it's really avoiding that I infect other people. That's one important consequence of wearing a mask. Of course, you protect yourself as well when you have an appropriate mask, but you also protect other people. And the government plays here a very important, has to be a role model there. And this is why, for example, I liked it when the Austrian government showed up with masks in TV. They indicated that the situation is dangerous and that everybody should wear them. Then there are a few other questions that we could take up here.
Yes, exactly.
Can I also say something?
Yeah.
I want to say something also about surveillance and trust. We in Israel created 3 types of surveillance. The first type of surveillance was statistical. We basically approached the cell phone companies and said, don't tell us anything about any person, just tell us how many people moved more than half a mile away from their home for more than 3 hours. So we kind of pinged their survey with a response and said, give it back to us. And give it back to us by town, so we can compare towns. And basically, we don't know anything, so there's no violation of privacy. Another approach we used was you download an app on your phone, and we send to your phone the pathways of people who've been identified with corona, and your phone calculated locally whether your path crossed, and if it did, it told you, but it never reported back to anybody else. So it was your discretion to find out where it is. And then there was, the powers that be in Israel's security that monitored people in a different way. I don't know much about that. But in any case, this is really going back to the question of a public good problem. Like when we were setting these methods, I think that privacy is a little bit like paying taxes. There's benefits and there's costs. And in a case of a crisis like Corona, sharing our information with other people has tremendous value. I would have loved people, even before we had massive testing, I would have loved to tell people to report every day about fever. I would have loved to know about cough. I mean, there's so much to know. But as a society, we get so much to gain if people share that information. Now, we have this notion of privacy, but I think we need to get over it. And not because, the state can be bad, it's because it's a public good. Like it's just a shame to say, let's not get our information out there and all of us could be better together. Because, this is a case.
And there is a case here for behavioral economics interventions, because there is a real paradox here. And the paradox is that we give away our private information all the time when we are on the internet. So you click on a website, a sub-website shows up and says, we use cookies. Do you want to allow us to use these cookies? And if the website, if you don't allow, the website doesn't work properly for you, basically. So they basically put the price, they make it costly to use their website unless you submit to their giving up required privacy requirements. And we do this all the time. Now, at the same time, there's a very big fuss about privacy when it comes to contact tracing. And I have the feeling that different communities out in society raise their voices when we speak about these issues. There are those specialists that always warn about privacy violations. So these are kind of the professional warners. But if you look at the people, at most of the people, they give up privacy all the time. And then it's played up quite a bit when it comes to really an issue where you could do a lot of public good by giving up your privacy. When people usually give up their privacy, they do it for a private benefit. But therefore, I believe if we had the right instruments to nudge people into this situation, and here I'm appealing to you because you are much more creative here than I am, develop nudges to motivate people to give up their privacy for the public good for a limited amount of time. So they have to have the option to shut it down again, or the government commits itself to shut it or to reconsider the situation and to potentially shut it down when the situation becomes better. But we need the cooperation of the people here a lot.
Yeah, this is the privacy, data privacy discussions seem to me always be the discussion of wealthy countries, wealthy communities, because in other countries, I don't know if I'm correct, then it's not that topic, right? They don't care about it so much as we do and have this discussion now. We don't, in Switzerland, we try since years to put all our medical data on one, like a credit card, and then you go to see the doctor and every information is on that same credit card. So we don't get it right now. And e-voting, all that stuff, it's a discussion of the wealthy nations. That's what I think. How do you assess that, Dan?
So yes, I think you know, the more information you get in modern societies, in prosperous countries, the more worrisome it gets. But I think that the point is that we call it privacy, and we need very different names for it. The moment you say it's my information, it doesn't really help. There's so much information, and there's been an explosion of information, and treat it as privacy, yes or no, is way, way too simplistic. I think that the moment we become citizens of a country, we give up some rights for the country. You give up your right to drive in a red light. You give up your right to drive drunk. You give up all kinds of rights because you understand that it's for the public good. There's a lot of things about privacy that have nothing to do with the public good. Like, I'm not interested, for example, in the government understanding exactly my sexual proclivities. Right? But that's not the same to say that everything I do doesn't have a value for society. So I think the simplicity of the privacy people is hurting. And what we need to do is to develop a more nuanced view of what kind of information we think belongs to people, and nobody should see it, and so on, and what kinds of people are inherently about the good of the nation. So that's that for that.
Thank you. There are some more questions. Just let me get them in. Marco, for example, asks, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had no idea how lethal the disease is. How could we have learned much faster without putting people at risk of their health, without locking down economies? Who wants to answer?
So we can't, as Ernst said in the beginning, you don't know you lock down. That's understandable, because the risk of locking down too much is less than the risk of locking down. Sorry, the risk of locking down too little is frightening. The risk of locking down too much for 2 weeks until we figure it out, I think is a better risk. But we could have done lots of things. For example, my inhumane proposal of infecting people, volunteers, on purpose, in 4 weeks, we would have learned a lot. In 2 weeks, we would have learned a lot. Tracking people who are already in the household with somebody who was infected and seeing what happened to them would have been a better approach. Look, we have people infected all over the world. There's been very, very wonderful collaboration on the biology side. The DNA of the virus was very early detected, mapped, distributed. But on the actual infection, who is infected, under what conditions, we just didn't have a collaborative approach for that. We still don't have good databases of who got infected, who didn't get infected. We did not interrogate all the people who came in close contact with the people who were infected and try to figure out which one of them got infected and which ones not. And this has been going on for a while. Even if you say, you know, there's a period of 2 weeks that we don't know if somebody is infected or not, in a month of concerted effort, we could have learned a ton. The problem is we didn't spend much time on trying to understand the virus as we did on creating very strict rules of lockdown.
What surprises me there is, if I can quickly jump to Sweden, because Sweden had another system, and the man responsible for the strategy of Sweden was very much involved in Ebola epidemic in Congo and wherever in Africa. So he had kind of an experience about spreading a virus, a very dangerous virus, and he considered a completely different strategy for Sweden. How do you observe this? Is this a more, let's say, intelligent way of dealing to deal with a virus with an like this?
Well, I think the jury is still out, which is the better strategy.
Okay.
And the reason is this: a lot of the economic costs of the pandemic does not only arise from the lockdown. So Sweden had less severe measures, okay, but still the economic costs that have been imposed by the breakdown, or breakdown is perhaps too much to say, but by the reduction of international trade. I mean, Swedish companies also cannot sell. They have a lack of demand because everybody is kind of first reducing their investments, and reducing consumptions means lack of demand for companies. So the economic costs in Sweden appear to be pretty comparable to the economic costs that we had, for example, in Switzerland. Despite the many different measures the governments took. Now, the advantage of the Swedish strategy, there are costs and advantages. The advantage of the Swedish strategy may turn out to be in the long run that more people have become immune. And that is kind of an advantage because they are at least temporarily, when they have developed the COVID-19, they are at least temporarily immune, not forever, but it seems that they are less likely to get it next year or the year after next year. Now that's an advantage, but they also have more death. So there's a benefit and a cost here. And I think in 5 years' time, we may be able to really disentangle the issues, and it may turn out to make not so much difference what the strategy was of the government, because we are so involved in an international system where everything depends on everything.
Yeah.
And that means, yeah.
You know, you asked, was this an intelligent decision? An intelligent decision, we don't judge just by the outcome. We judge based on the information at the time, right? And first of all, we have to agree it was a very brave decision. It was a very brave decision to do something that other people are not. But I think at the time that they took that decision, I think that the world looked like this disease is going to affect mostly people mostly people who are older, mostly people with other diseases. And at that time, it looked like social distances is going to be to play a role. And it looked like a reasonable decision. I have to say that the moment they took it, right, you have to say, what did we know at that moment? In 5 years, we could say they were wrong, but you know, we would find out, for example, whether you can create immunity antibodies or not. We don't know yet. That, of course, will change dramatically the picture of whether they're correct or not. But was this an intelligent decision? I think yes. I think a lot of the other decisions were way too restrictive, right? They were panicked, driven, and restrictive. Now, I will say something about Sweden. I have lots of friends in Sweden. I'm following what is going on, and the Swedes are actually not really following social distancing. You know, when this started, we said, oh, you know, the Swedes never touch each other anyway. Always. I hope there's nobody from Sweden on this. We said, you know, they keep social distance anyway. But if you actually look at what's going on, the pubs are full. I mean, people are. I think they're celebrating social closeness more than they did in regular days, particularly the young people. And that brings the notion of, I think that it feels like a rebellion. I think it's something about the Swedish approach from this. So, you know, it's hard to manage it. And part of the spread of the disease is not because they decided, let's do social distancing. People are not adhering to that as well. And that adherence is also very, very different from country to country, from age group to age group. So hard to judge. But I think at the time, if you ask me, at the time when they made that decision, I thought it was the right decision for Sweden.
Excuse me, Ernst, to come back to your plan of this wide-ranging randomized testing, there is a question from Nastasia. She says some governments in developing countries do say they have limited resources to do massive testing as do more developed countries can. What can be done if there is so-called limited capacity?
Well, I mean, the question is how limited it is. If it's really an issue of limited capacity, then it's even more important that you deploy the resources that you have in a useful way. And of course, you need to be able to test those people who come to the hospital or that come to the health worker and have symptoms. That's clear. And if they don't have resources beyond that kind of testing, then the only solution is that the international community tries to help to increase the resources. So it's an issue for philanthropy. It's an issue for other governments to help here, or to redirect money that has been kind of dedicated to some other causes, at least temporarily, to the testing capacity. So, because from an economic viewpoint, we say, where should you invest where should governments invest their money? Well, they should invest it where it has the highest social value. And I think currently there's a high social value for putting the resources into corona testing. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget that the developing countries, they still suffer from many other problems, malaria and other diseases. And I think we shouldn't forget that. So I think they have to balance their needs given the resources they have. And if they don't have the resources, they have to appeal to the international community, to the Gates Foundation, or to governments to help to increase the resources. There's no other way to do that.
Another very important approach is the pooled testing, right?
Yeah. Testing, yeah.
And the pool testing basically says, take 100 people, take blood tests from each of them, or take a sample from each of them, depending on what test you do, pull them together and test that sample.
You pull them, exactly.
Yeah. And that basically says, if it comes negative, you know that nobody is sick. Of course, if it becomes positive, you don't know how many people are sick. So I think one thing is basically pool testing. And there's all kinds of very nice equations for all kinds of nice things and how to do it. And then another thing is to figure out what are the places we want to test. So imagine you took all the towns in a certain city, and you said, let's sort them out. Let's sort them out from the most likely to the least likely places to be have infection, right? We probably know something about the riskiness of the place. Like if they have public transport, that's more risky. If population density and so on, and if you do something like that, you can try to identify the places that testing is most likely to be informative and help you change the policy. So you could say, let's take the places that have the highest potential risk, start with them, and as long as they're below a certain level, let's keep on testing. And if that place went above the level and we're doing quarantine, stop testing for a while, move somewhere else. So I think there is intelligent testing, both from between towns as well as pool testing.
So what is your suggestion? How could we build more cooperation that people who are maybe not in a risk group or have less fear of getting the disease and so on, how can we motivate people to be more cooperative?
So the first answer is that there's not a single parent who is being in lockdown that doesn't want their kids to go back to school.
Yeah, can imagine.
I think that's the best incentive. If you take a town and you say, if you guys would agree to testing, we could get your kids back to school and you could continue with your life in some way. Yeah. I think there'll be tremendous pressure. Now I'm saying this, of course, it's true, but I'm also saying it in jest. But you know, there's contribution to the public good. Wearing a mask helps the public good, even if it doesn't help as much the individual. If you know, there's all kinds of things that we do for other people. There's also a lot of things we get from the public good. Like if you live in a country that is clean and you live in a country that has high trust and you live in a country that other people pay the taxes, everybody benefits. Now, often what we see is our sacrifice for the public good, but we don't see the things we get from it. And I think for something like this, when we want to galvanize people quickly and with a high probability, I think we want to reflect to people the things that they get from public goods. So if you say, look, as long as the infection rate is below X, this town will be open, great. The moment it drops before that, we would have to be a lockdown. As long as it's above this, schools will be open. If not, we'll have to do something else. So we can make it more apparent that we get value from public goods. And think about something very symbolic, like opening parks. Right? You can say, we want to go out, we want to exercise, we want to enjoy parks, but if we do it, it doesn't work. And then another thing that we did in Israel is we try to galvanize people around keeping the health of the elders. We did this in a couple of places when we got small villages to focus on all the individuals above age 80 that lived there and said, we're keeping these people alive, right? It's not an abstract, amorphic, so on. We have pictures of people that we want to keep alive. We make the public good, in that case, keeping people's parents, grandmothers, grandfathers alive, much more salient. So I think there are ways to make it apparent. People are interested in it. Naturally, we're inclined for public good, and we can make it even more so.
Thank you.
I would like to add to this. I mean, in the end, whenever we have to appeal to voluntary cooperation of the people, there is typically lots of different types of costs on one side and lots of different types of benefits. And for example, and basically, depending on people's individual propensities to comply or to cooperate, some are more or less willing to incur a private cost for the public good. So whenever you tilt the private costs, you reduce the private costs for being cooperative, you get more cooperation. That typically works. And for example, that means in our context, when we demand people to self-quarantine and to not go to work or to stay at home, they have to be economically protected in order to have an incentive to do that. And if they are not protected, they won't do it. Now, this is the disaster of the US health system, for example, that aggravates the problem tremendously, because people, first of all, they don't have what we call short-term work, now Kurzarbeit. They have there's 35 million people, and of the 35 million people, perhaps 20 million lose their health insurance. So basically, they are exactly not protected in that way. And this aggravates the problem incredibly, that compared to, let's say, some European countries. So what I'm basically arguing, we have to appeal to the public good, and and people respond to that. We know that from a lot of scientific evidence. But at the same time, we also have to have sanctioning apparatus. We have to have. When I say we need voluntary cooperation, I'm not saying we need no sanctions. I'm only saying sanctions alone are probably not going to work, but for some people they work. And as Dan pointed out, I mean, 10% of non-compliers here in the pandemic creates probably much more damage than 10% non-compliers when it comes to tax compliance. So we need to use the whole ensemble of things that we have here, not just sanctions, economic benefits, appeal to the public good, and so on. Well, that's my response, but maybe we can go back to, there's so many questions here.
Yeah, I see. Sometimes, which one would you like to answer, Ernst?
I'm listening with one ear to Dan, and with the other I look to the very good comments that we have received. I mean,
I have the benefit, I'm not wearing my glasses, so I can't read any of the questions.
But just to go back and to make sure, there's one question to summarize this. Would you want to force people to get tested or keep it voluntary?
I mean, we have developed, for example, when newspapers conduct a randomized survey, then they don't force, the survey company doesn't force people. They have developed tools to get people to comply with randomized methods. And I am pretty sure that we would have enough voluntary compliance in this case if you make it simple. I mean, if you have easy drive-ins, if you have many spots, so to speak, where you can be tested, I wouldn't be worried that we have too little compliance when it comes to the randomized testing. And randomized, by the way, means that you need a very small amount compared to the whole population. I mean, what is 10,000 people compared to a population of, let's say, 8 million in Switzerland? So to be honest, here I think the voluntariness is not a big issue. The voluntariness is a bigger issue when it comes to contact tracing. Because here we would love to have 60, 70, 80% of the population being part of that, because then it becomes most effective. And here I'm more pessimistic that we will get these numbers without some very explicit incentives to do that. So I think there is here space for clever nudges and clever public interventions. I have not thought enough about it that I can give you a proposal here, but I think there are now still almost 500 people here listening. Whenever somebody has a good idea, let me know, and let Dan know, and let the public authorities know how we can induce people to do that.
Yeah, so I think the issue is, what we care about is the percentage of people who get tested. If we can get to that percentage with voluntary testing, that's great. If we can't, now we have a cost-benefit analysis of, do we want to force people? And you know, it's usually not a good idea to quote anything that Iran is doing as a good methodology, but Iran actually has a very interesting approach to organ donation. And what they say is, you don't have to be an organ donor. But if you're not an organ donor, you also can't get a donation from somebody else. which I think is a really nice system to say you can be in and out, but you can't get something from the public good without contributing to it. So, even when we talk about forcing people, there's all kinds of ways of forcing people. And
how can you compare this to this testing COVID-19?
So you could say, look, if you don't want to be tested and help us migrate the disease, if you get sick and you need help, don't come to us as well. Right? You want to be on your own, you don't want to play in the pool with everybody else, fine. But you can't be on both sides to it. You can either participate or not. I'm saying that's very different than saying it's €1,000 fine. It's basically giving people some more freedom. So even when we talk about sanctions, there's all kinds of sanctions. And the one I like the most is to say, we're all playing a collaborative game here. You don't want to play, that's fine. Just don't ask us later to get the benefit of the public good.
This is a very interesting point, then, because that reminds me of the beginning of the Corona pandemic, because we had a lot of elderly people saying, I don't want to be rescued, I don't care, I'm old, I'm, let's say, 80 and something, whatever, and just let me die if I get it. Leave me alone with that. Let me out, and if I die, I do not want to have ventilation or whatever. But they were not hurt, so they were not taken seriously. They were.
But there is a very important point here. I think people should have the freedom to say, I don't want ventilation and I don't want to be helped. Okay, like people also have the freedom to commit suicide.
That's another discussion, right?
Yeah, so I think that's fine. So I think that we should respect that. But we shouldn't respect the right to infect other people. So that is something very different, And this is a negative externality, and that it needs to be made clear that infecting other people is morally wrong. And we have to make, and I'm coming back to the masks, Masks are about, to a large extent, protecting other people. And this is exactly why they are a contribution to the public good. And I think we should make that clear. There's a distinction between endangering yourself and endangering other people. Now, I want to respond to something that Dan said before. In the context of organ donation, I think the principle of reciprocity makes a lot of sense. Let's say, if I'm unwilling to donate my organ in case I have an accident, and a lethal accident, then I should also have not priority when I need an organ. So I'm perfectly fine with that rule, because why should I know there are people who disagree with me, but I would be willing to defend that quite also as morally correct. If people are this is because this is also a public good, and having enough organs is also a public good, because in every country many people die because of lack of organs. So having a bigger pool of organ donors would be a public good. But I doubt that we can extend that principle in the case of a pandemic. In the case of a pandemic, by definition, so to speak, my contribution to the public good is small, is extremely small, and I benefit from the collective effort of everybody else. And I have the feeling that ruling out people, not giving people proper treatment when they conduct will create a lot of moral objections. But I haven't thought enough. Maybe not, but I have my doubt here that it will work.
Yeah. One more thing about do not resuscitate. We tried actually to pass some laws to do not resuscitate. And one of the things we wanted to do was when people get tested for corona, to give them the form to see if they want to sign that or not. For all kinds of political reasons, we were not able to do that. But I think in general, it is a good opportunity. The corona crisis is a good opportunity to examine questions about the right to die and to get people to rethink about what documents they want to sign and what are the boundaries. You know, the official profession of physicians is to worry about minutes of life, not about quality of life. They're trying to extend life at every cost. They don't care about quality of life. It's not your job. We need to think about the trade-off between minutes in life and quality of life and figure out when is misery not worth it. And I can tell you, as somebody who spent 3 years in hospital, I certainly don't want to die in hospital. I'm fine dying. I don't want to die in hospital. These are miserable, terrible places. Dying while people are trying to push life into you, trying to restart your heart with electrical pulses, pushing things down your throat. It's painful. It's frightening. It's just a terrible way to go. You know, every time we make a meal, we want to end in a highlight, chocolate cake, and it's true for all experiences. We try to end them with a highlight, and then life is ending in this lowest possible point. Like it's the most miserable. Like you would never design a life, and you said, "Let me end it with pain and misery, and fear and stress." Yeah. So I do think we need to. It's a question that nobody wants to deal with because it's so politically complex and morally complex. But I think it is a good time to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. Ernst, you were asking about ideas coming from our audience, you know, to strengthen the cooperation. One came via Twitter. Someone of Twitter suggested a lottery prize distributed to the pool of people that contribute testing.
Yeah, and also I think these are useful additional things to consider. The same for contact tracing. You know, I think the contact tracing is the willingness to be part of that. Maybe the real issue. Less so the willingness to be part of, to be tested. You know, the test is so simple. I mean, they take a saliva sample and then, so the individual costs of taking a test is just going to the site where the test takes place. And then they can send you basically via iPhone or via SMS your test result. So it's a very minor cost. I think people would be willing to wear that. I think they are less willing to give up their privacy. It's just a speculation. I don't have data on that. Mm-hmm. There also was a question here that I find interesting. Somebody asked, but there are lots of surveys. They come from epidemiologists, but there are very little random tests which help answer the many questions. Can you tell me why governments don't want to do this? Well, I think initially they didn't want to do it because they didn't have enough test capacity. And now but that was not a sufficient reason. So, I mean, that was a sufficient reason not to do it, but there are other reasons that come to play now because they have now sufficient test capacity, at least in European countries. And here I believe it's a lack of understanding in the relevant community. I mean, to be honest, epidemiology is much more correlational than our other social sciences or other sciences. So randomized controlled trials it's done, but I have the feeling that epidemiology is a lot more about correlation than about causation. And when you come from, let's say, political science and economics, we underwent this causal revolution and brought about by these randomized controlled trials that kind of makes us sensitive to the necessity of random tests.
Yes, sorry. Gentlemen, we approach the end of this wonderful talk. So my last question, would you dare to think about the post-corona time? What do you think will be the biggest changes in human behavior?
Well, that's largely speculation.
Sure.
Many will have discovered the benefits and the costs of home office. For many people among those who are listening, perhaps that plays less of a role, but because many may have jobs that allow for flexible work at home anyway, for many of us. I believe the most important, I hope that the most important lesson that will lead to that will be implemented is that we need collective, we need plans for a collective response in the future to these pandemics. They have been totally neglected, and the government if the main lesson is that we will have plans that we take out that we take from the shelf and can implement when a new crisis emerges like that, then I will be more than happy. And I'm very confident that we will do that in Switzerland, because Switzerland is a country with DNA, the risk aversion is built into the DNA of Swiss society. So I believe they will develop it here. I'm not sure that they will develop it in other countries. I hope, but that's only a hope, that in countries that have bad social security systems like the US and other countries, and countries that can afford it. I mean, US is one of the richest countries in the world and has one of the worst social security and health systems, in particular for the poor population. I very much hope that we will see a push in the right direction here to undo what has been done to Obamacare and other things. But
Dan.
In the post-corona period, I think we would learn to schedule some time between different Zoom calls. But we're not there yet, and I scheduled another call at exactly 7. So I'm sorry, and I have to run. Lovely to spend some time with you. I'm sorry I have to depart so quickly.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, to Israel. Thank you for being with us. Ernst, I just checked, because if you look at the inputs, they are very interesting. And I suggest that, dear audience, send your inputs to info@fairadvice.com or testtheworld.org. We would collect them and would be happy to read them. And yes, Ernst, you could have the last word.
I was constantly trying to do the multitask. I'm very bad at multitasking, reading and listening at the same time, because there were really interesting comments and statements. So yes, please send it to these email addresses. And let me just reiterate what I said at the beginning. Maybe some of you did already sign during this conversation for this public initiative that that demands taking actions in combating the coronavirus. If you have not done yet, just do it now, then you don't forget it, because we humans tend to be very lazy. We want to sometimes to do things and then we forget and we don't do it. So just do it the next 5 minutes to help us push politicians towards a sounder approach to combat the coronavirus. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Ernst Fehr. Thank you to Fair Advice and partners who organized that and are very, very active in this initiative. Thank you to our audience for being so active and interested around the globe. And I hope to see you soon. I don't know. Goodbye. Have a good evening.
Yeah. Bye-bye.